January 1944. The sky above central Germany was a pale gray sea streaked with silver trails. At 25,000 feet, the sound was a deep, continuous roar. Hundreds of engines pushing east. The daylight bombing campaign had begun again. Below, farmers and factory workers looked up as the distant hum thickened into a storm. For months, they'd watched American bombers come and go. B-17s and B-24s moving like migrating clouds, each mission leaving fire behind. But today, something was different. German radar operators on the outskirts of Hanover noticed new blips traveling with the bombers. Smaller, faster, and impossibly steady. Observers peered through binoculars and saw something they had never seen before. Single-engine fighters still flying deep inside the Reich. Until now, no Allied escort had ever made it this far. At their airfields, Luftwaffe pilots were already scrambling to intercept, unaware that the balance of the air war was about to shift forever. The Americans had brought a new kind of weapon, sleek, powerful, and unrelenting. It was called the P-51 Mustang, and from this morning on, the skies over Germany would never belong to the Luftwaffe again. By the end of 1943, the skies over Europe had become a graveyard for Allied bombers. The US Eighth Air Force, operating from newly built airfields across southern England, launched mission after mission against the heart of Hitler's industrial empire and paid for every mile in blood and aluminum. At first, the strategy seemed sound. American generals believed that precision daylight bombing could cripple the German war machine. Factories in Schweinfurt, ball-bearing plants in Regensburg, oil refineries, and aircraft assembly lines, all were marked for destruction. The idea was simple: strike during the day, when accuracy was highest, and let British night raids complement the damage. But there was one problem. Once the B-17s and B-24s crossed into Germany, their escorts had to turn back. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that guarded them simply didn't have the range. By the time the bombers approached their targets, they were alone, slow, visible, and vulnerable. That isolation turned every mission into a slaughter. In October 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt, 291 B-17s took off. Only 198 returned. 60 aircraft fell in a single day. More than 600 men either killed or captured. For the crews who flew those missions, the fear became routine. Each morning began with the same ritual: a briefing, a breakfast, and the quiet glance at the empty bunks that followed each mission. At their peak, daylight bombing losses reached nearly 30%. No Air Force in history could sustain that. The message was clear. Without long-range escort fighters, the strategic bombing campaign, the very cornerstone of America's air strategy, was doomed. High Command needed a solution, and they needed it fast. Factories in the U.S. were already working around the clock, and the Royal Air Force was experimenting with engine swaps and hybrid designs. Somewhere in that frantic search lay the answer that would change the air war entirely. It would come from an aircraft born not out of American design bureaus, but from an urgent British request. A new fighter that would finally fly with the bombers, fight over Berlin, and bring them home again. The P-51 Mustang began not as a symbol of American dominance, but as an emergency British idea. In 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged, the Royal Air Force was desperate for new fighters to fill the gap between the Spitfire's agility and the Hurricane's endurance. They turned to North American Aviation, an American company that promised to design a completely new aircraft. Not a copy, but a faster, sleeker, and more efficient fighter, in just 120 days. What rolled out of the factory in September 1940 was the NA-73X, the prototype of what would become the P-51. Its lines were revolutionary: a laminar flow wing that reduced drag, a deep radiator belly scoop that doubled as a form of thrust recovery, and an aerodynamic grace that made it unlike any other fighter in the sky. Early test flights stunned engineers. It was fast, stable, and deadly accurate. But there was a flaw. The first models, powered by the Allison V1710 engine, performed well at low altitude but lost power above 15,000 feet, a crippling limitation for bomber escort duty over Europe. In American service, it was initially used for reconnaissance and ground attack. The promise was there, but the heart of the aircraft was missing. That changed in 1942, when British engineers fitted the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same engine that powered the Spitfire Mk 9. The transformation was immediate and astonishing. The new P-51B and P-51C models climbed faster, flew higher, and could now match or exceed the speed of any German fighter. Even the feared Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190. More importantly, it could fly farther than any Escort before it. With external fuel tanks under its wings, the Mustang's range stretched beyond 1,600 kilometers. For the first time in the war, American bombers could be escorted all the way to Berlin and back. When the first squadrons of the Eighth Air Force received their Mustangs in late 1943, pilots immediately sensed the change. The aircraft handled like a dream, responsive, balanced, and capable of diving or climbing out of danger with ease. It could dogfight at altitude, chase down Me-109s over Germany, or race home with engine damage and still land safely. The Mustang wasn't just another aircraft. It was a weapon of endurance, the embodiment of Allied engineering convergence. American manufacturing met British engine design, and the result was something the Luftwaffe had not prepared for: a fighter that could meet them anywhere, on any front. By early 1944, the U.S. Air Force had its answer to the Luftwaffe's supremacy. The next phase of the air war would no longer be about survival. It would be about domination. The skies of Europe were about to become a proving ground for this new machine, and for the pilots who would fly it into history. The P-51 Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a precision instrument of engineering that bridged two continents' best ideas. Its genius lay in efficiency. Every rivet, every curve, every inch designed for range, speed, and balance. At its heart, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine transformed the aircraft's purpose. With a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, the Merlin allowed the P-51 to maintain power above 25,000 feet, where most German interceptors began to fade. It could climb faster than the Focke-Wulf 190 and dive longer without tearing itself apart. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns in its wings gave it both reach and ferocity. Their combined firepower could shred a bomber or slice through an enemy fighter in seconds. But what truly made it revolutionary was its range. The Mustang could escort bombers to Berlin, more than 1,500 kilometers from England, and still dogfight on the way home. Its drop tanks of 75 and 108 gallons extended missions deep into enemy territory, something no Allied fighter had achieved before. Aerodynamically, it was decades ahead of its time. The laminar flow wing, thin, smooth, and scientifically contoured, reduced drag and fuel consumption. Combined with a radiator scoop that generated Meredith effect thrust, the aircraft effectively recycled its own heat into forward power. The result was an aircraft that could cruise faster on less fuel, a perfect match for the long grind of the strategic bombing campaign. To maintain that performance, the Mustang demanded skilled maintenance and disciplined piloting. Ground crews worked tirelessly in freezing English mornings, draining oil, checking spark plugs, and patching bullet holes before dawn takeoffs. Pilots learned to trust the aircraft's stability. Its ability to dive at 500 miles, recover cleanly, and re-engage within seconds. Every aspect of the P-51's design told the same story: calculated dominance. Where earlier fighters had been built for defense, the Mustang was built for pursuit. It could strike deep, stay longer, and still fight its way home. By early 1944, its introduction wasn't just a technological shift, it was a psychological one. The Luftwaffe's greatest advantage, distance, had vanished overnight, and as the Mustang's shadow crossed the German border, the men inside the Reich's cockpits began to realize that no part of the sky was safe anymore. For the men who flew them, the P-51 Mustang was more than machinery, it was a lifeline. Inside the cockpits of the Eighth Air Force, pilots spoke of it the way infantrymen spoke of rifles: personal, trusted, alive. Before the Mustang, escort missions ended in heartbreak. Bomber crews watched their guardians turn for home over the Dutch coast, leaving them to face the flak and the waiting squadrons of the Luftwaffe. They knew what came next: black bursts in the sky, vapor trails twisting into fire, empty seats at breakfast the next day. But in early 1944, the first Mustangs arrived at airfields like Leiston, Debden, and Bottisham. Their presence changed everything. The bombers no longer flew alone. From horizon to horizon, the sky filled with the silver silhouettes of the new fighter, its wingtips glinting in the sunlight, its roar cutting through the bomber drone. Crews cheered when they saw them form up alongside. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, it was a different kind of awakening. The Mustang could appear where none had been before: above Leipzig, near Dresden, even over Berlin. German interceptors, once confident in their altitude and home field advantage, now found themselves hunted from takeoff to landing. The same airfields that had launched them became ambush zones. Tactics evolved quickly. American squadrons, under leaders like Colonel Don Blakesley and Major George Preddy, were told not merely to protect the bombers, but to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe. "Go get them before they get us," became doctrine. The Mustang's speed and range allowed new strategies: fighter sweeps ahead of bomber formations, roving patrols deep inside Germany, and aggressive free hunts that targeted enemy planes even before they reached formation altitude. On the German side, morale began to crack. Experienced pilots like Adolf Galland and Günther Rall understood the math. Training programs couldn't replace the losses fast enough. Every downed ace meant the sky grew thinner with skill. Young replacements arrived with barely 30 hours of flight time, sent against men who had already fought across 2 oceans. Inside their cockpits, they often saw the same thing before the end: a flash of silver in the sun. Then tracers. The Mustang had changed the air war's rhythm. What began as defense of the bombers had turned into the systematic dismantling of the Luftwaffe's will to fight. In February 1944, the air war reached its breaking point. The Allies called it Operation Argument, but the men who flew it would remember it as Big Week. 6 days of relentless bombing designed to cripple the German aircraft industry once and for all. It began on the morning of February 20th. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s lifted from English airfields under a thin winter sun, each formation stretching for miles. Their targets were the factories at Leipzig, Gotha, Augsburg, the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe. Every bomber was escorted this time by something new: P-47s, P-38s, and now the long-range P-51 Mustangs that could follow them deep into the Reich. German radar stations picked up the incoming waves long before they arrived. Orders crackled through headsets from Berlin to Munich. Abfangen! Intercept! Fightergruppen scrambled from bases at Kassel, Braunschweig, and Frankfurt. The Luftwaffe expected the usual: to catch the bombers after the escorts turned back. But as they climbed, the sky began to fill with shadows that shouldn't have been there. Mustangs. Dozens of them. Diving through the thin cloud layers, guns flashing, breaking up the intercept before it could form. For the first time, German pilots were forced to fight defensive battles over their own runways. Every time a Messerschmitt climbed, two Mustangs were already waiting above it. Those who broke away from combat returned to bases that were under attack themselves, strafed by fighters that had once been too far from home to reach them. The effect was devastating. Within days, the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft, destroyed in the air, burned on the ground, or abandoned for lack of parts and pilots. But the physical damage was only half the story. For the first time in the war, the Germans understood that nowhere was safe. Their factories could be bombed by day, their airfields attacked by night, and the Americans would be waiting even on the flight home. In those 6 days, the balance of the European air war shifted. The P-51 Mustang had not just escorted the bombers, it had turned the hunters into the hunted. And yet, the true test was still to come. The long escort into the heart of the Reich. Berlin. March 4th, 1944. The day the Americans reached Berlin in daylight. It began before dawn across eastern England. Frost clung to the wings of the bombers as crews climbed aboard. 730 heavy aircraft bound for the German capital, escorted this time all the way by P-51 Mustangs. To the men who had flown through 1943, it felt almost unthinkable. No one had ever flown this far into Germany and survived. By mid-morning, contrails stretched eastward across the North Sea. German radar tracked the formation's steady approach, and alarm bells echoed through Luftwaffe command posts. Fighters scrambled from Jüterbog, Verneuchen, and Wittenberg. Experienced veterans like Johannes Steinhoff and Walter Dahl climbed to intercept. But even before they reached altitude, they saw them, silhouettes glinting in the sun. Single-engine fighters, too small to be thunderbolts, too far inland to be possible. P-51s. When the first formations clashed over Wittenberg, the Luftwaffe's confidence shattered. The Mustang could climb with them, turn with them, and dive past them in a blur of silver. Its pilots, calm, methodical, often younger than their German counterparts, stayed glued to their bombers until the interceptors struck, then broke away to engage with ruthless precision. Eyewitness accounts tell of German pilots returning to base, shaken and silent. Many landed with ammunition untouched. They had never reached the bombers. Others never came back at all. Over Berlin, the first bombs fell just after noon. Columns of smoke rose over the city's rail yards and aircraft plants, and above the chaos, the silver fighters still circled. Proof that the Luftwaffe's most sacred assumption that the capital could not be reached by daylight had just been erased. By April, Mustang squadrons were ranging freely across the Reich. They strafed airfields, trains, fuel depots, anything that moved. The Germans began calling them the Little Friends, half mocking, half resigned, because to every bomber crew, those little friends meant life. Within weeks, Luftwaffe resistance over central Germany collapsed. Entire Gruppen were grounded, starved of fuel and pilots. And the few veterans who survived now faced a truth none of them had dared imagine: that the war in the air was lost, not by numbers, but by endurance. The Americans could now strike anywhere, anytime, and always with protection. The skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of the force that had once terrorized Europe. In the span of just a few months, its veteran corps, the men who had survived since the early campaigns of France, Britain, and Russia, had been decimated. Big Week and the Berlin missions had drained not only aircraft but experience. And in aerial warfare, experience was everything. Between February and June, the Luftwaffe lost more than 2,000 fighters and nearly as many trained pilots. New planes rolled off German assembly lines, but they were flown by boys. Some barely out of flight school, others with less than 40 hours in the cockpit. The Allies, by contrast, fielded squadrons of veterans who now owned the sky. Fuel shortages compounded the collapse. Allied bombing raids systematically targeted oil refineries at Leuna, Merseburg, and Ploiești. By autumn, many German units were receiving less than 30 gallons of aviation fuel per week, barely enough for a training flight, let alone combat. When the few remaining FW-190s or Me-109s managed to take off, they were often met by swarms of Mustangs before they could even climb to altitude. The psychological toll was immense. Former Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland later admitted that the arrival of the P-51 turned the tide of the air war overnight. Even Goering himself, in one of his final staff meetings, is said to have remarked bitterly, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. Every mission from then on was survival, not strategy." The German Air Force, once the pride of the Reich, was reduced to fragments. Aircraft hidden in forests, camouflaged under nets, and pilots praying for enough fuel to take off one last time. The balance of the skies had irreversibly shifted, and with it, the course of the war in Europe. The triumph of the P-51 Mustang marked more than the defeat of the Luftwaffe. It signified the birth of true air supremacy, a concept that would define modern warfare. From early 1944 onward, American bombers flew with impunity. Factories that had once produced tanks, ammunition, and aircraft for the German war machine were now reduced to smoking craters. Rail networks were shredded. Oil fields burned. The Reich, once built on mobility and speed, found itself paralyzed from the sky downward. The Mustang made this possible. It was the bridge that connected the industrial might of the United States to the heart of the enemy's territory. Its pilots became the vanguard of a new kind of warfare, where reach, endurance, and precision mattered more than numbers or territory. Every sortie that reached Berlin, every train strafed in Saxony, every Me-109 left burning on its own runway proved the same truth. The Allies could now dictate the tempo of battle anywhere in Europe. The aircraft's reputation spread quickly. On every front, American dominance was visible, over France, over Italy, over the North Sea. Mustang squadrons ranged so far that German civilians began calling them the far-flying death. But among Allied crews, they were simply the angels. Bomber losses plummeted. Morale soared. Crews who had once flown, knowing they might never return, now crossed enemy territory under a silver shield. When D-Day came in June 1944, that shield expanded across Normandy. Mustangs swept ahead of the invasion fleet, clearing the skies for the greatest amphibious assault in history. By the time Allied soldiers stepped onto French soil, the air above them was already won. The P-51 had not just changed battles, it had redefined the limits of power itself, and its shadow would linger long after the smoke over Europe cleared. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the P-51 Mustang had flown more than 200,000 combat sorties across Europe and the Pacific. It had escorted bombers to every corner of the Reich, destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the air, and helped turn the tide of the greatest air war in history. But its legacy reached beyond numbers, beyond victories, beyond even the war itself. For the men who flew it, the Mustang became a symbol of trust, a machine that brought them home when nothing else could. They remembered its hum at dawn, the way sunlight glinted on its wings, and the quiet comfort of knowing that, at last, the sky belonged to them. For those who faced it, it was the sound of inevitability, the final proof that industrial might, ingenuity, and endurance had combined into something unstoppable. In the years after the war, Mustangs flew on, in Korea, in smaller air forces around the world, in air shows and museums where the sound of its Merlin engine still echoes like a heartbeat from another age. It remains one of the rare machines that bridged art and engineering, speed and grace, destruction and deliverance. But perhaps its greatest meaning lies in what it revealed about the human spirit. That victory in war is not only about invention, but about adaptation, the relentless pursuit of improvement when failure seems certain. The P-51 began as an emergency project, born of desperation. It ended as a legend, built through cooperation, courage, and resolve. And when German pilots looked up and saw those silver wings stretching from horizon to horizon, they weren't just witnessing defeat, they were witnessing the arrival of a new world. A world where air power would decide the fate of nations, and where one aircraft, born from necessity, perfected by design, proved that freedom could fly farther than fear. The Mustang didn't just win battles. It changed what mankind believed was possible in the skies.